Thank you. Those were wonderful presentations, all of you, and interesting resonances, obviously, between them. They all had to do with, maybe not so much with your material, but I will say, almost all had to do with the integration of architecture and graphic design in the production of ornament. I wanted to start with a question that you raised. You raised it as a question of whether ornament has made a revival. And I'd like to put it to all four of you. Can we safely say at this juncture in history that ornament has made a revival?
We all look to you.
No, I was very convinced by Julia's analysis, actually. You know, it's sort of, I mean, the idea that I'd never quite heard put that way, maybe you guys all knew it already, that ornament originally was sort of disdained as a way to disguise the, you know, flaws of handmade objects, and with mechanical production, you should celebrate the perfection of that, and now this advanced mechanical production permits the reintroduction of ornament. I think it actually, it seems very true to me. And some of it seems sort of superficial in all senses of the word that Michael, good and bad, raised. Some of it seems to really sort of have a possibility of kind of becoming dated. But like, you know, if anything else, it's just going to like lock everything into a time and place, which I think is good. It does seem to be coming back.
I'd ask Julia a question, because is another way to see the issue that ornament was under-theorized for a period, and now it's kind of become theorized again. It was always there, it's just we didn't know how to talk about it actually in the modern period, because there's a lot of aspects to modern architecture, for instance, the use of the I-beam, or things like that, you know, that were purely decorative, ultimately. They weren't structural, they weren't, or, you know, the use of mechanical gray color on Mises support systems or things like that. So it was there, it was suppressed, and the language was a different one, because it wasn't floral, but it was still ornamental, and so we just forgot to talk about it.
I would agree. I think the discussion too often is focused on, is it a resurgence or not? And I think that shouldn't even be part of the question, because it has always been there. I mean, if we consider the I-beams on the Seagram building, those are undoubtedly added ornament. I mean, you can certainly argue that. I think that what we need to focus on is keep that discussion updated. And that is something that has not been done. A lot of architects that I talk to in research for this have still shied away from using that word, and had quite strong reactions to when I used the word and suggested that what they were doing might have been ornamental. People have very personal definitions of what ornament is and what it isn't, and some see a very strict distinction between ornament and decoration, and it's a discussion that should be ongoing, and that could very accurately describe these new forms going on. Yet because of the definitions that have been put on from past times, we're just not discussing them anymore.
Well, I was thinking also that in a contemporary way, because we had worked on the building at IT with Koolhaus, and you know, one of his mantras is, you know, no money, no details. And anytime there was no money, we made a picture of the detail and pasted it on the building, you know, and it just became this way of representing the same idea, but it just became this artificial way of doing it, you know. And I think that it's almost the reverse of hiding the lack of craft. It's now value engineering a kind of device. So you know, wood grain wallpaper can replace very expensive zebra wood, and you can do that in a very intentional way, where suddenly the thinness of it and the cheapness of it becomes part of the story of it too. Yeah.
Do you think that the collaboration that you were both describing between architects and graphic designers in adding some dimension to the, I'm trying to avoid the use of the word ornament, as adding some dimension or to the structure of a building, does that betoken a different relationship in general between these disciplines? How would, I'm getting into sort of a wonky subject here because it has to do with the practice, but there are a lot of practitioners in the room. The fact is that we're talking about, not coming in and just slapping something on a wall. You were, and nor were you. You were obviously brought into projects where there was a fundamental idea that this was more than something that was superficial in the bad way, in the bad use of the term. Does this suggest that, whatever else we may theorize about it, there's a praxis dimension to the application of ornament to a structure that's hopeful, or not?
Well, I think maybe I can't separate from economics because I think that there is an aspect of it. Don't you think sometimes that the inclusion of the graphic is because it's cheaper?
It's compensating.
Right. Yeah. You can do something really big and really splashy for a very $7 a square foot.
But you could do nothing at all for even less.
Yeah. Actually, you can't because doing nothing at all, you have to do it really really and
Yeah.
So. Yeah. The sheetrock is this untheorized material also. So you have this kind of thing which is sheetrock's an incredibly plastic material. You can kind of cover anything with it. And you're supposed to not see it once you cover it. Like how many soffits have you seen, and you can't see the air conditioning duct behind it. It's a huge thing through the space, but it's covered with sheetrock, so it disappears somehow. So you have this kind of material which is untheorized already, and then you have, then you have to do something to it because it doesn't look that great. And so wallpaper comes in because you can somehow dress it up for not very much money. So I don't mean to diminish it, but I do think that there's aspect which is that there's a way. It's kind of a media. There's a way to make an impression, to do something fast and contemporary that no one has to really believe in because it's not going to have to last forever. So the administration can be not too worried about it because they can take it down. There's all these things about it. The temporary nature of it, and all those things are things I really like about something like wallpaper, which is that it's incredibly transient material. But on the other hand, it can have this incredible impact in a space. So you can have both sides of it. Where I think if you had to really build something out of gold leaf and some kind of special material, that everyone gets much more worried about it because you're spending a lot of money and it takes a lot of time and it's going to be there forever, and there's a lot of things that come into the conversation at that point. So.
Right. I mean, speaking of wallpaper, you showed several views of your Prada store in New York. And when that store opened a few years ago, of course it was, and rightfully so, a sensation. I personally have not been back recently because I personally don't spend a lot of time shopping in Prada. How is it wearing? How does it look to your eye right now? Or can you judge?
Well, that's the beauty of it, which is you change it all the time. So, I mean, my small New York Times moment, not nearly as glamorous as Michael's, was that there was the store burnt down at a certain point, and one of the first lines said, "Damaging and the wallpaper installation by 2x4," and it's like, whoever writes about a fire and they say it damaged the wallpaper, it's just like I felt it was like my shining moment. I think that's and I think that was Rem's intention about that, which was it was this, kind of intentionally low form. Wallpaper is a really low form in an intentionally high space. So in some spots there's zebra wood ceilings, and on the other side you have this cheap wallpaper, and you have this kind of combination of high and low all the time. And I think that's the nice thing about it, which is you don't have to live with it too long. It has a kind of temporal aspect to it, and it can be, in a way, architecture is slow. It's super slow. It's slow to make it. It's slow around, and this can be a way that changes the speed of architecture. So.
Yeah, and it has the potential of. Ornament is something innocuous about it. I think it's shocking to architects and to theorists and to Adolf Loos and people like that, but normal people, it's like, that's sort of, things look funny if they don't have ornament, and so it's not like it's, I actually find from Cheryl's presentation, the provocative, words are shocking to people, offensive to people, can be interpreted in all these different ways, and that's why I think when we were working on that one project, the single project I talked about, a lot of the alternatives that were just kind of like putting diagonal lines on it or something, those were purely ornamental, and they sort of, I can't say they were rejected by the team because they were innocuous, but they just didn't seem to like, they couldn't, there was too much pressure on, they didn't seem to mean anything.
Right,
then you put some words on it and like, oh my God, Well, we weren't thinking, oh my God, we just thought we were kind of like captioning the landscape beyond,
Well, I think there was one of the accidental things that happened today was, your yellow letters and your yellow letters, and these kind of two different scales, but I saw them actually very similar things, and yours are even more temporal, that aspect where they just, they coalesce for just a minute and then they go away, and I think that's the beautiful aspect of that project, which is that, it's almost like radio more than typography, it's this kind of thing where it forms for a second and then disappears into the ether again. And you probably weren't thinking yours was going to be temporary, but
No. There were two.
Well, I had a question about your presentation, Cheryl, and it's going to sound so awful, so let me see the best way to phrase this. Okay. When we talk about things like the DIY movement or nostalgia, I'm like, no brainer why that's around. It makes perfect sense to me what people are reacting to and against. When I look at performative, body-oriented letter forms, I'm wondering, we live in a culture now where we can express ourselves in thousands of different ways, through artifacts, through clothing, through anything we want to slap up on Facebook, and obviously with not a whole lot of typographical, opportunities there. So why the letter form? Do you feel there should be, or are you tracking the revival of the letter form as being this extremely poetic, expressive medium, when all of our language began as just an abstraction anyway? It was just there to represent sounds, not necessarily, even though people were slapping on every other kind of expressive gesture with it.
I think that a lot of the examples that you just gave, say for example posting on Facebook, those things don't require us to put our bodies into it, and I don't think that we're expressive in a way, but it doesn't really make us think about how we express ourselves with our bodies. And I think that a lot of the designers that I spoke to, the reason why they wanted to use this medium was because they wanted to get away from the computer. They felt limited to the tools that they had. Like they don't just want to use the toolkit that Adobe releases all the time. So they wanted to bring it out into the urban environment and do what they wanted to do with their bodies. And it's a very flexible medium, and it's also flexible because people can interpret it the way that they want. One of the designers that I spoke to, who I also showed an example of, Amandi Alessandra, she also said that it allows people to realize that if it can look like an A, it can be an A. So I think that, yeah, it's a really nice thing. I think it makes it more human, whereas the communication between us, it's so ephemeral. We always text and all that kind of stuff, but we're always using the same interface, and I don't think we're as expressive.
Yeah, I guess the only point I would make, and I'm really not pushing this because I think that the work is so beautiful that you showed and exciting, and I can see why it exists in the world, but it's that we have speech when we get face-to-face communication that replaces the computer. So.
You don't spell out things to people when you see them?
No, but I think, it is poetic, but I think the poetic meaning of it is actually rather concrete. There was that essay the controversial, I think, essay that Malcolm Gladwell wrote a few year or so ago, where he was talking about the difference between 60s protest movements and contemporary ones being the amount of commitment it took to sit in at a lunch counter versus the amount of commitment it took to retweet a inflammatory, call to action, right? Yeah. Which you can do anonymously, which you can do in seconds, which you can do without getting out of bed or turning off the TV, right? And what I saw in the work that Cheryl was showing was an attempt to reconnect personal, physical commitment to a cause with communication. And in fact, I would argue that you can't, a half dozen people, or however many people it takes to spell occupy, sort of standing silently, spelling the word out, is different than them chanting it over and over again or chanting anything else. There's something about, I think it is provocative in a way, and playful in a way, and gives pleasure and joy in a way too, but also sort of says, I am here. And in the digital world, whether it's your Facebook status or a tweet or anything else, the I am here is, where really,
I'd like to kind of try to theorize your project a little bit. I'm going to take a shot at it. Because I think in a certain way, when Michael and I were in school, we still had big boxes of lead type, and there was this kind of physicality to text. If you think of Caslon owning his matrices, and that was basically his property, and there's these things, there's these physical things in the world. And I think that aspect of the ephemeralization of typography, which becomes more and more extreme, where there's kind of no core to it, that kind of exists as a series of electronic moments. And I think that your project, where the words can only form for a brief second, they can only form in one perspective, they have this kind of incredibly fleeting aspect to it. And I think that has, and I think when you show some of the other projects too, it's the typography starts to lose its material quality, and it becomes, for instance, not two weights, but kind of blowing up and, falling down, and it becomes this plastic material in a way different from a steel material or a lead material.
It is awesome. There's just
I
no
think
question.
it becomes an experience that requires both the designer and the audience to think more thoughtfully about what they're saying.
Point. Michael, I'm going to actually have to wrap up a little bit soon, but whenever people talk to you, often, they want you to recall your Vignelli years, as if it was some kind of like crazed,
that often. No, we'll go on.
tenure,
Yeah.
the 5 typefaces
Yeah.
that limits the rigidity. But it's hard not to bring it up right now in this conversation. While you were working for Massimo, was there a secret part of you that was just dying to do something in fluorescence? Did you go home at night and did you do things with, I don't know, your French curve that Massimo would never have approved of?
Oh, I know. While I was there,
Don't go into the French curve business.
French curve, no.
You don't want to know what Michael was doing with that.
Yeah.
Just between us
Yeah.
and Twitter.
Exactly. It was, in a way, I was struck, what Michael was just saying about the I-beams in the Seagram building really rang true with me, and I was thinking of it when I was looking at that image up there. I think that ornament, modernists love ornament. They really do. They just call it something different, and they are weak before that. They succumb to that impulse all the time, but they sort of somehow camouflage it for whatever reason as some expression of functionality, whether it's sticking non-functional I-beams on the outside of your building to make it look ever so much more functional, or in Massimo's case, he really would sort of figure out what the function, he still does. He sort of goes to the functional heart of a thing and then almost exaggerates that function in a way until it sometimes past the point of functionality. Hence, the 1972 subway map, which was really beautiful, had a logic behind it that was watertight and was judged by a good part of the population as being useless because it's despite its watertight logic, it didn't conform to the way that geographic reality behaved in the city. So, and that impulse he had to kind of perfect that map, and I saw him do it over and over again, was really about just making something look that way that he wants it to look. It's just the same way that Richard Meyer always puts porcelain gridded tiles on the outside of things. Why? Because they function the best? Because it's more pure? No, he just likes it that way. He just can't help it. And I think, and I really think that impulse is just sort of, that's about being human in a way and kind of being expressive. So it was funny, most of the things that I learned, that I kind of took under heart from Massimo, I did it sort of for the opposite reason. He would say that these five typefaces, were the best ones. I would sort of say, well, people can't tell the difference between many more than 5 typefaces, so why bother wasting time brooding about the difference between Bembo and Saban and Perpetua? They're all different, but they're all the same to my mom. So pick one, stick with it, and just kind of beat it to death as long as you can stand it. That was my philosophy. Not because Garamond was better than Saban. How could you prove that? But just you get used to. You just know exactly how that thing will perform, and that lets you worry about what the word says. As opposed to kind of teasing people with these subtle differences. So I actually learned a lot from that experience of working for what, for the purpose of this audience, would be you could regard as a high modernist. But I also learned that high modernism had a very kind of human, subjective impulse behind it as well. And I think even being exposed to that made me suspect that any kind of high modernism so represented was also kind of an expression of very personal impulses where the rationale was applied after the fact in a way.
It strikes me a little bit when arguing against fashion, fashion design, that somehow it's immaterial. And when, basically 10,000 years people have been talking about skirts and jackets. You can go, it's a subject which has been relevant for so long. It's hard to say that it's irrelevant now. And I was really struck by that was in the Times a few weeks ago, they had these artifacts they found in Mongolia or something like that, and they were just the most exquisitely beautiful, tip to a bridle or something like that. Absolutely beautifully worked. They're 8,000 years old. So these are impulses that are, as much a part of being human as anything else. And I think it's just a matter of the language we use. But that impulse, I totally agree with you. I think that modernists love ornament and they love color. You look at those Mies van der Rohe buildings, and they're always in black and white photographs, but they were incredibly colored. The Lily Wright colors were these lurid colors, practically. And they, because they like them. And I think it's
So there's something innate, even like the innate need to deface a white wall and to create something out of it, that might be something that's just programmed within us to try to take, any surface and either stamp it with our own individuality or make it pleasing, but in a universal way, in a way that.
Ancient Rome was covered with graffiti. I mean, it's like it's just a natural part of us.
Yeah, nature abhors a white wall.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, all four of you. It was terrific.
Thank you.